Brother Carter, we are here, and it's an honor to be with you. Thank you for making the time to be with us.
Well, it's an honor for you to ask, and I did debate a little bit whether to do it or not, and then I thought, well, if something I know of done might help somebody.
Yes, sir.
And I've got to face the truth that I'm nearing the end of my ministry, so if it can still be a blessing to somebody following me.
Absolutely.
So
let's start. We have, you were gracious and you gave me this book, His Hand is Real, Events and Stories Clearly Showing the Hand of God. Tremendous book. Other books you have, testimony. We could sit here and spend hours talking about your testimony, but tell me briefly, how did you get to Landmark Baptist Church? Tell us about your salvation and then how you ended up coming here.
Well, I got saved at 22 years old, and the story is that, of course, I was into my hot rods and racing in those days, and a couple of new girls, sisters, moved to town. One of my friends told us, and of course, boys at that age was interested in the girls, and I said, well, let's date them. He said, they're funny, they won't date you. I said, what are you talking about? He said, I don't know. I said, they're strange. I said, well, they date me. I'm a hot rod driver. My picture and names in the paper every week. I'm a hot shot. I was macho and didn't know the word.
Yes, sir.
But he said, okay. He said, I happen to know the phone number. You call her and see if she'll date you. Boy, she told me right off, yeah, I've heard of you, but the only place I'd go with you is church. And I argued with her a little bit, and he was sitting in the car. No cell phones in those days.
Yes, sir.
So I was at a payphone at a service station.
Uh-huh.
Well, I either had to go back to the car and tell him she wouldn't date me, or I had to agree to go to church with her. So that's the way I heard the gospel the first time.
Okay.
I slipped off on Sunday night. Nobody knew where I was. I was still living at home at that time, and they'd say, where's Mickey? I don't know, he just disappeared. Sunday night I was going to church. Little town here, not so little anymore, but Haines City was pretty small. And
wow.
I said, if I went to church in this town, everybody knows me, they'd laugh at me. I heard all the excuses. And she was smart. She'd come down from Detroit, Michigan area, saved in an independent Baptist church.
Okay.
So she knew there was an independent Baptist church in Winter Haven. So she told me, so we don't have to go to church here, we can go to the next town. She was setting me up, and I didn't know it. Went over there, and that preacher, he didn't, I joke about it, I say he didn't only shell the corn, he threw the cob at you. And he got through to me, and that's where I got saved.
Okay.
About a year later, or less than a year later, we got married, and I started serving the Lord in the church, doing everything. Give up the hot rodding, had a real story on that. That's in part of my testimony, how the Lord stopped me from the hot rodding. And I started doing everything in the church, finally became a deacon and a youth leader over 7-8 years, I reckon.
Okay.
A long time. God kept calling me to preach, but I wouldn't admit it. Preachers would say to me, when my pastor was gone, he'd say, cover for me on Wednesday night. Well, I'd get up and do something.
Yes, sir.
And so everybody, well, you're called to preach. Well, I didn't want to admit it.
But you felt like you were, you just didn't want to admit it.
Yeah, the preacher was up on a pedestal with me. I thought I could never be that, I was a country boy. I'd come up through the hot rod gangs and all that stuff. Sir. And so I just didn't think that I could do it, and yet God would let me alone. And I remember the night I actually surrendered to it. We'd had a pretty good church service. I had an old, we lived a little bit out in the country by that time, wife and I did, built a little house, and I had an old bird dog. Now, that's a dog that hunts birds. He don't fly.
Yes, sir.
But anyway, I walked out to the dog pen to feed him just before bedtime, looking up at the stars and talking to the Lord, and boy, the Lord just swooped down on me, and I cry now thinking about it if I'm not careful. And I told him that night, I'll go.
Yes, sir.
I argued with him. I can't lead singing. I can't sing. I can't do this. I can't do that, and all that. But boy, he broke my heart that night. Me and him out there weeping under the stars. So help me God, quiet as it could be. When I finally kind of come out of it, still had the dog food in my hand. I turned, and that old bird dog, I swear he knew something was going on. He had his head down, his tail out, and he was looking at me, froze like he was pointing. He was reverent.
He was reverent.
He knew something special.
He knew he was on holy ground.
Yeah, that's right. So anyway, that was when I actually surrendered to the Lord, and then went to a little Bible college that existed in Lakeland, Florida then.
Okay.
Now I'm still working my job and everything. I talk to our kids now in college and say it used to be tougher. I used to have to be in class at 7 a.m. in the morning, and we'd have half-day classes up to noon. Well, I crammed in what was supposed to be a 3-year degree in 2 by going back to night classes too. By that time, my brother and I had started a little business so I could adjust my working hours.
Yes, sir.
So I got my first little degree there, and kept serving in the church. Just kept serving. Well, the college would send me some little church here or there to preach on a Sunday, and that's where it got started. I actually, while I was in college, took a church up in Sumter County, up in the farming area up there. Old church, but had never had a full-time pastor. So I preached for them, driving up, preached for them, and they put in to call me as pastor, and I was kind of scared of that, but I thought, and I prayed this prayer a lot to the Lord. One of my supply runs in my business was to drive from Haines City down to Tampa to the warehouse. Now I'd see these little old white church buildings off to the right. You can still see them. I think they're still there. And I didn't know nothing about them, what they were, Baptist, Methodist, whatever they were, this church building. I said, Lord, you know, maybe I could take a church somewhere where the people, nobody else will take it. Just nobody else will take it, so I'll take it, and then I may can help some folks. You got to watch what you pray for. Because that first little church I took was at the jumping off place. Not much population at all, never had a full-time pastor. So I started preaching for them while I was still in Bible college. I'd drive 65 miles every Sunday morning, stay all day, and got to where I'd actually drive back on Wednesday nights. They called me as pastor. I moved on the field, made a full-time church out of it, and pastored for a year, actually 3 years, year and a half in college, year and a half after I got out. Sold my part of the business to my brother and just went full-time. And God saved a lot of people. A lot of the stories in that book right there of answered prayers, things I saw God do and couldn't have been done with, it had to be God, you know, those kind of things. And I could talk all day on some of those things. But I realized I had finished my work there. I was still young at that time.
Did you feel like that was a training ground for you?
Yes, I learned.
Not to use it as a stepping stone, but it was a training ground.
And as I look back on it, I wouldn't take nothing for it. I've often said, I appreciate the seminary training, but I got more training practical on the field. And to this day, I mean, you got to learn. I say you will learn about people, you'll learn about situations, and you'll also learn to depend on God when there's, I mean, I took a little building. If they had 35 on Sunday, they were happy. Well, bus ministries hadn't got going much in those days.
Yes, sir.
And there was no bus territory. We were talking, if you found a set of ruts somewhere, you followed it and hoped there was a house down there. You know.
Yes, sir.
But we got up to where we were running up close to 200, and the building packed. A lot of folks say one of the best revival meetings I ever had, that was ever part of. We had 41 souls saved in 5 nights. And people come from 20 miles away. It had to be a movement of God because, and we baptized 40 of them, and another little Baptist church way down the road baptized the other one. And so, I mean, it was, till this day, I mean, we've had some great meetings in my latter years in ministries, but as far as one where I knew God did it, and it had to be, I mean, we didn't have the machinery, we didn't have the organization, we didn't have the money, all those things.
About what year? About what year?
That would have been 1968. Yeah.
So you're there, you know God's timing, it's time for you to move on. Did you know where you were going, or you just knew it was time?
No, I just knew God was telling me. And during that time, especially that last year I was there, people would show up at my church from Orlando, from Sarasota, from pretty much in Florida, asking me to come and preach in view of a call at their church.
Yes, sir.
I went 2 times. Most of them I turned down because I just didn't feel God. And each time I went, it was a I remember a church in Orlando, preacher, we got a great big brick parsonage. We got this. And I mean, they had, compared to what I had there, I mean, but I didn't even go. I'd tell my wife, I said, I just don't feel the Lord's in it. I've got to feel the Lord's in it. So of all the most unlikely places I wound up was here.
You come back to Haines City.
Yeah, where I'd graduated school.
Right.
Where I'd got in trouble with my hot rods and the law. And,
were you nervous about being a hometown boy?
Oh, very much. And I talked to God about it. I said, the scripture says a prophet's not without honor, saving his own country. And I can tell you, like I say, you're dangerous when you're picking my brain because I got so many stories there. But this was a supernatural one to me. I knew the preacher that was here at the little church. He was not full-time. He was working his head off at another job. I'd met him years before, had a little building. He'd started the church right here on this piece of property. They had about a half acre of ground at that time. And Bill was his name, Bill Edmondson. But Bill wanted me to come preach a revival for him here. And I told him, I said, Bill, that's the town I grew up in. That's where I graduated school. They still got my record at City Hall for speeding and all the things I got in trouble. I couldn't be a pastor in that town. Yeah. Oh, he said, God's telling me you the man. I said, so I finally agreed to come preach revival. Preached Monday through Friday night. Now this is a solid truth right here. He had 22 in Sunday school the Sunday that we started a revival on Monday night. People heard that the hometown boys made a preacher, and some of them come to see if it was true.
Right. So
we actually had fair attendance, especially him. He thought it was great that people would turn out. The meeting went well. He had 22 in Sunday school. Every night we had folks saved. At the end of the revival, we had exactly 22 more saved. On the next Sunday, he had 44, just double the number. All the numbers worked.
Wow.
The last night, Friday night of the meeting, like I say, we were having several adults saved every night. The very last night of the meeting, the last one, I believe, that walked the aisle was an old flagman that had flagged me on the racetrack. He came to see if it was so.
If the stories were true.
And of course, we were a regular independent Baptist church. He was a good pastor that was here, but the church had never grown much, and he struggled along with it. But anyway, the very last night of the meeting, old Brother Sam, the flagman, walked the aisle to get saved. And his wife shouted all the way from the back. And she'd never done nothing like that. She was a very meek person. When he stepped out, I knew it was her. I heard her hollered, and the whole church was so excited, you know. He was a local man. Everybody loved him and knew him.
Yes, sir.
Here's the rest of the story, though. I went back to my church, and Bill called me in about a month, 2 months. He said, the church wants to call you as pastor because I'm leaving. I'm taking a church up in Tallahassee. I said, Bill, I've told you I can't be a pastor in my own country. Well, they really want you. He called me about 2-3 times. Finally, I told him, I said, I even tried to send him some of my preacher friends I'd met, gone to college with. He never got, it never worked. They'd come and no. He called me at least 3 times or 4. I finally said, Bill, don't call me no more. I'm not going to go. Well, I got miserable over that. I mean, really miserable. And God was working on me. But my wife and I talked. Can't go back there. She said, oh, that'd be the last place we'd ever want to go, because hometown and all that. We agreed to that. Well, I had a evangelist friend come in and preach a meeting for me that I already had scheduled, and I had a lot of respect for him. He was well known in the independent Baptist circles. Wendell Correll was his name. He was pastoring then over on the East Coast, and God built a church over there with him, but he's been dead now. So Wendell come in. We had him over for supper before meeting that night. And my wife and I said, we'll run this by Wendell, and we'll tell him that why we shouldn't be going to Haines City. So he's eating, and we're talking, telling him all the reasons, all the reasons we couldn't do it. Finally, he looked up over his food at me, and he said, God's trying to hit you between the eyes of the two before any boy. He said, God's calling you down. Yeah. I said, Wendell, I didn't want to hear that.
That's the exact opposite of what you wanted to hear.
I want him to confirm that I didn't. Well, now here's the rest of the story. I got up the next day at the end of the meeting, which would have been on Monday morning after the last Sunday night service. Up there, I had to drive 25 miles all the way to Leesburg, Florida, to the nearest hospital to visit a church member. So I got up and made that visit that morning. But here's the thing. On Sunday night, after I come in from church, I was burdened so much. What had really happened that morning, when I got through preaching on Sunday morning, it was a regular service. For us, I was as prepared to preach as ever. But I got the feeling while I was preaching, I'm not preaching, I'm just talking. I've lost it scared me. I've lost my unction.
Yes.
Scared me. That I was fighting God over this call. So I came back for church that night, and I was scared to preach, Brother Tillis. So what I did, I called up a teenager. We had some teenagers saved. Set him on the platform, and I set a chair side of him and sat down and took him down the Roman roads, teaching soul winning. Because I was afraid to preach. I didn't tell him I was afraid to preach, but I was.
Yes, sir.
So I went home that night, and Sonia went on off. My wife went on off to the bedroom. I went to the little office I'd created in the house. And I mean, I stayed with the Lord till 2, 3 a.m. Finally, here's what I actually did. I said, Lord, I'll go to Haines City if I've got to. But I've told them not to call me no more. If you really say I got to go, they'll call one more time. So I get up on Monday morning, go to the hospital. By the time I get back, it's noon. Well, the wife has the sandwich fixed, and we sit down at the table. I hadn't said a thing to her that I had told God I'd go that night.
Yes, sir.
Because we'd both agreed that not to even consider that. Phone hung on the wall beside the eating table, and it rang. I picked up the phone, and it was Sam, the one that got saved in my life. He said, Brother Mickey, I know we ain't supposed to call you no more, but God told me to. He said, I'm not even eating my lunch. I'm in the bathroom. It's my noon break on my job. He said, I went to the bathroom. I've been praying, and God said, call you one more time.
Unbelievable.
And so My back's turned to my wife. I thought I'd kind of back God in a corner that night, I guess. And Sam called. I said, Sam, tell the church I'll come Wednesday night and talk to them about it. And I turned around and looked at my wife. Tears was running out of her eyes too. She said, I told God last night if we had to go, we'd go. I didn't know that.
Golly.
So that's how I got here. I came on that Wednesday night. It was a day or two before Christmas. And the teenagers had taken the pulpit down. They were doing a little Christmas program. A few teens they had. So I had to take the choir podium and set it down front after their program was over. So I preached on without a vision the people perish. And so help me, Brother Tillis. I was a little bit mad at God. God's making me come. So I got
You're preaching about a vision, but you're still a little mad at God.
I thought if I'm hard enough, they'll say no. So I got up and I told them how mean I was, how hard I was going to be.
Yes, sir.
And I said, you folks don't have enough people here to split. So if I don't get 100% vote, I'm not coming. I mean, that's what I said. So I took my wife by the hand. It was a little old building. The building's still over there. We turned it into other things. Had a middle aisle. So we go out the aisle. It was a fairly cool night around Christmas time. We went out the door and stood outside the door for them to vote. I figured they'd talk a lot, but
yes, sir.
They didn't talk much. I mean, in just a few minutes, one of the few deacons they had came out and he said, "Preacher, you got it 100%. Nobody. So that's what got me here.
Okay.
And as far as talking about big church and little church, it was the smallest place in town.
Preacher, let me ask you something.
Okay.
I know that we see. I know that God still works.
Yes.
But it feels like, and forgive me, I'm trying to think of how to say this from my heart, but it feels like we don't hear as much of those kind of stories like we used to.
I agree.
And I wonder if it's because we don't give God an opportunity to do something great. Maybe we've got too much mechanical. Maybe we've got other things we depend on. I don't know how to explain it. I'm not trying to belittle everybody, but we don't hear these great stories. I feel like we hear them in the past, but now today, something's missing. What is missing? Why don't we see that as much?
Well, I've had some of those same thoughts. I do think it has to do. Of course, we know the Scripture says without faith it's impossible to please God, and we all do have faith. But I don't know that we walk out on the limb maybe as much as we used to where it is totally up to God. I mean, I've had so many stories through the ministry here where if God, and my prayer, see now I'm retired, I'm supposed to be anyway, well I am. I say I'm tired and retired, but anyway. The truth is, as I reminisce, I realize, and one of my prayers now is I thank God over and over, Lord, you provided grace for this. I got myself in this mess. You got me out of it. I couldn't have got out of it without you. I couldn't have won that victory. And I know it had to be God. That title of that book right there probably is what I'm trying to say. His hand is real.
Yes, sir.
That's what those stories in that book will tell you.
Yes, sir.
And I'm not some guy that's trying to make money off of telling miracle stories. Mm-hmm. In fact, I never made any money off the book or anything. It's just truth is, it had to be God. Mm-hmm. And I don't think maybe that preachers are quite as easy to put themselves in a spot where if they prove God, so to speak.
So. Okay, is it a cultural thing? Is it an age thing? Is it a people thing? Why are we?
Well, you know, our culture's changed so much with all the cyber stuff. I didn't have that. I'm still an old dinosaur. My wife has so-called smartphone. I still have a flip phone.
You got the flip phone.
And don't use it much. She fusses all the time. She said, why don't you turn on your phone? I said, I can't. Somebody might call me.
Yeah.
But truth was, I had more than I could take care of. So when the computer age came and cyberspace came, I actually made a willful decision as I began to see folks get hooked on it. Mm-hmm. I'd have somebody come to my office for counsel. Next thing you know, the cell phone's ringing.
Yes, sir.
I got to the place, I said, now, folks, if you want to talk to me, I want you to turn off your phone before we start.
Right.
And the kids, of course, oh, Lord, what's done to them?
Yes, sir.
So anyway, we do have more machinery. We are more tempted, I guess, to depend on the extra things that maybe the earlier preachers didn't have to,
yes, sir,
to depend on. I could, time would not allow to tell so many stories where things pop in my mind. I remember visiting a couple in the country church, younger couple, school teachers, public school teachers, and they'd been married maybe 3 years. The wife had had about 3 miscarriages, couldn't have a baby. He wasn't saved, she was. She played the piano some for me in church. And I was wanting to reach him. Well, he's a school teacher, had his education. So he gave me all those kind of arguments.
Sure.
But it come down to the fact they wanted a baby so bad and they kept having the miscarriages. His name was Danny and Kay. And so I said, well, God can give you, no need to pray for no baby. He was pessimistic.
Hardcore.
Yeah. And finally, in all the conversations, get to the bottom line. I said, Daddy, he said, she's pregnant again, but said it won't last. Said, just a few weeks. And I said, Danny, I'm going to pray right now that God will let you have this one. He just poo-pooed that.
Yeah.
But I did pray. I remember getting in the car and saying to God out loud, Lord, I put us in a real spot.
We're both on the line for this one.
Yeah. And she had morning sickness. She had all the problems, but the baby kept staying alive.
Wow.
Finally came down to a Saturday night, 25 miles away at the Leesburg Hospital. The baby was going to be born. The hospital wasn't all that luxurious. We all sat in a stairwell. They wouldn't let us in the delivery room. So he and my wife and myself and her mother were all out in the stairwell when the baby was born. But in that talking to him, I said, I'm going to prove God. God's going to prove himself. You're going to have the baby. Well, he knew the gospel. He'd come occasionally to hear, but he was critical, Well, Saturday night, Sunday morning, 1 a.m. when we left that hospital. The time I got home, it was almost time to get ready for breakfast in church.
Yes, sir.
So I went to church that morning and Sunday school. I get up to preach, and just as I'm opening the Bible, the door opens and Danny walks in, sits a few rows back, and sorry, brother, tell us.
That's all right.
You could feel the spirit in the building because it's country people. Everybody knew everybody.
Yes, sir.
It was a big deal. The word had gotten around probably to a few of them that the baby had been born. When I gave the invitation, Danny walked the aisle that morning and got saved. That's the kind of thing. And he made a deacon later in the church. His wife's dead now and all, but one of the last times I went and preached homecoming for him, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, that baby was a young married lady.
Nice.
And that's the kind of thing. And that's why I think that story may be in the book. There's many stories like that. Because my early prayer when I surrendered to preach to God was, God, it's got to be you. You got to be real. I knew I didn't have the ability. And my ability lay in a different direction, you know, with cars and stuff. But more than one time, I saw God come through where it just had to be God.
Had to be God.
Just had to be Him.
So, so you come to Landmark where there is no vision, the people perish.
Yes.
So sitting here in the pew in this facility where we are, did the pastor Mickey Carter that first Sunday when you came, did the vision that you have there look like what it is now, or did God change that and redirect that? And I ask because I think sometimes the modern preacher today, we're told you got to have a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, a 20-year plan. You don't need to cast vision, all that.
I wouldn't fit that plan. I didn't. The truth was, and one time my wife and I were at some meeting or something, and somebody was asking us questions, and she gave as good answers I could ever give on it. She said this: no, we didn't really have a plan per se. We just wanted to serve God, and we started serving Him one day at a time. And that is the truth. One day at a time, without... I might have in 50 years taken 2, maybe 3 official vacations. Now, I don't recommend this to young men. I say take care of your family and your wife and all of that. But we just had a mind to work. And she cut a little clipping out of a book or something, and it showed this little kid talking to his preacher dad. And he was saying to his dad, Mom and I want a real vacation. We're tired of these preachers' meetings. And that's about, I mean, she'd go with me on occasionally, and I didn't go a lot. I purposely did not go a lot. I had so much I felt like I was doing, maybe over much. In fact, somebody asked me, a reporter one time, for whatever reason, was in my office, what would you do looking back on your ministry? Whatever the context was. I said I'd probably say no a little lot more often. I got myself overloaded and stayed overloaded. Seemed like I was always, there was never a day that I woke up hardly, but I knew I had something to do. You know, I didn't have to hunt for it. It was coming at me, you know. Now, I don't recommend all that. I'm just saying that was the way it happened with me. So I look back now, because I'm looking back over the back trail, and I see the pure grace of God. I see Him giving me wisdom I did not have to handle various things. And people used to joke the preacher will fight at the drop of the hat, and he'll drop the hat. Because I seemed like I was always in something.
So would you say that there is no cookie cutter formula for pastors? Every man has to find his own.
Well, I do think the individual thing is sometimes nobody else is going to do it for you, and if you're not careful, you'll want to start doing just what somebody else has done, and maybe they've been successful in an area, but you tried, it may fail for you, may not work. I do think the individual man in the Lord, it's a personal thing.
Yes, sir.
Don't mean we can't get help from others. And I got lots of help from others. I saw somebody succeed. I thought, but I always had to kind of make it mine. It had to kind of be real to me.
Right.
I didn't, I saw preachers that could preach in the middle of the sermon, break out and sing and stuff. I would like to do that, but boy, what a fool I'd be if I tried that.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Stuff you. And I remember a preacher, I won't use his name, but pretty well known. You'd know him, and good preacher, talented. Well, when he got started out and preached, somebody said, come preach for me. He'd say something like this. He said, well, who do you want to hear? You want to hear Jack Hyles? You want to hear, he named 2 or 3 others. In other words, he could almost copy them if you wanted to hear them,
Right.
You want to hear Tom Malone? You want to hear Jack Hyles? You want to hear whoever, you know. Lee Robertson, who you want here? And one preacher told him, I'd like to hear you.
Yeah, exactly.
I'd like to hear you. And he said, that woke me up. He said, I realized I'd started off as a seminary student, hearing them guys and learning how to say what they said and the way they said it. And he said, it dawned on me.
Do you think it takes time for preachers to find themselves, find who they are, and get comfortable with how God wants to use them?
It does, because if a man, now in the world would use the word self-confidence, but there's a little more than that with a preacher. He has got to feel like that he and God are on the same page. He's got to feel like that the Lord is with him, or the Lord is directing him. I used to say about, I read this, about old Davy Crockett, the frontiersman.
Yes, sir.
He actually served some time in Congress, too. And they say he had a motto or a philosophy that once he figured something was the right thing to do, nothing would keep him from doing it.
Yes, sir.
That's the only way he would go. You couldn't change him. Well, I don't know much about him, but I know if you felt like God led you and God is this way, then you don't let somebody else talk you out of it. I had a good preacher friend here who's dead now for years that said, what's begun in faith, don't quit in fear.
Oh, wow.
That's not bad, is it?
That's good. What's begun in faith, don't quit in fear. So let me circle back around and ask you a personal question if I can. And I think this has to do with ministry as well. In listening to you, I feel like, I could be wrong, but I feel like that there was a different speed, a different cadence to the pastor's life of the old time than today. And a lot of the things you're talking about require time alone with the Lord. And I know the old preachers used to have, we call them office, they used to call them studies. I know a lot of preachers, in the morning time, I'm with God. And I feel like that the older preachers were able to do so much more with God, but their schedule almost seemed slower pace, or whereas today we're so frenetic, there's so much going on, but we don't seem to be experiencing as much. Can you speak to something like that? Am I missing that, or is that something that you've seen?
No, there's two sides to that. Today, with all the electronics and the buttons and all, the good part of that is, yes, you can get a lot actually done through the phones and through the computers and all. That part is a positive part. Because in the old days, where you could use the phone, you had to get in the car and go.
Yes, sir.
It took the time. But I also think, human nature being what it is, that a man starts depending on that mechanical part, on that online business and all that he can do. Whereas before, whatever the challenge was, the preacher didn't have all that at his fingertips. He had between him and God. And I could tell stories all day long about situations where if God had not shown up. Now, I don't believe in being presumptuous with God. I think you jump off the building, you're going to hit the ground.
Yes, sir.
You know. But at the same time, so many times, after the fact, after everything was settled down, I realized God was in that. Maybe I didn't know it right at the time. God was here and I didn't know it.
Right.
You know? And that's biblical too sometimes.
Yes, sir.
God was in this place, you know. Again, I may have a time or two, like I was telling you the baby story there, might have presumed on God a little bit, and he came through. But that's dangerous business. You got to own that. That was spontaneous, though. I didn't premeditate it.
Yes, sir.
I didn't say, you know. And so many times like that, and so many times I just took for granted God is going to answer this prayer because this is the right thing. This ought to be done. God's going to do this. You know? And again, maybe I was a little presumptuous a few times, but boy, like I say, that book's got a lot of those stories in it. I came here in January 1971, officially. I mean, I actually told the church there at Christmas time. So I came back, officially took the church Sunday, 1971. They had sold a few bonds, and they were revenue bonds. That means they were worthless.
Yes, sir.
And built a little building. And no records, I mean, no secretary, just. And I started, and that's okay. I had not much of that, so to speak, organization in my background either. I wasn't fussing at it, but it was just, I took a mess, because any of those people that held those bonds, they'd never been honored. I mean, the revenue, any of them could have filed a lawsuit and took the building. That's what I walked into. The pews, which looked a lot like these, same color, they had bought on credit. And way past due.
Yes, sir.
I was expecting the man to come get the pews any day. And there's some stuff we can laugh about now, but that was serious business.
Yeah,
I think it was $16,000. Might as well have been $6 million.
Yeah.
And like I say, Brother Tillis, I got one story leads to another. I had to try to trace down those bonds and make things right. And plus the reputation in the city.
Correct.
Everything.
Correct.
So I told my wife one day, I had talked to everybody I could, got every lead I could. Finally, I'd gotten an address of somebody I'd never met, older retired couple, way down in Sarasota, Florida. I came in and I told my wife that day, I said, I'm going to get in the car. I'd done this already a few days. I said, I'm playing detective. I'm trying to find everybody I can that's bought a bond, because I've got to make this thing good. I said, I'm going to leave tonight and try to find this address, and if I may have to stay down there. You want to go? Well, I'll go with you. So we took our old well-used car. We went all the way down the city limits of Sarasota. About 9:45, 10 o'clock that night, I finally, in a 2 or 3 story condominium, retirement condominium down there, knocked on the right door.
Yes, sir.
And old man came and had the chain on the door and looked. I said, you don't know me, sir. I'm Pastor Carter. I took the church where you bought some bonds, and I was talking to him through the door. And he finally, I guess, felt like it was safe. He said, come on in. I come in and sat down. His wife was already in bed, or had come out the house coat to see what was going on.
Yes, sir.
I explained to him, I said, the bond you bought is really worthless, but I said, what we're doing is we're refinancing everything, and it'll take me a little while, but I'm going to get your money. And he said, well, I still got those bonds. He said, they're in the safety deposit box in my bank. And I said, well, if you'll give them to me, I think it was about $5,000, which was a big lot of money those days to me. And he said, well, can you meet me in the morning at the bank when it opens? Well, here I am in Sarasota.
Yeah.
I said, yes, sir. So I went back. My wife still sitting outside in the car, in the parking lot. And I went back and said, honey, we got to spend the night here. So we found a very cheap motel, dangerous. I wouldn't do that no more.
Not today.
Not today. But we spent the night. Next morning I met him at the bank. So he went back, got his deposit box, and brought it out and set it on the table. And he took them out. And I said, now I had a legal paper there for him to sign. He just took them, he tore them up and said, you forget it.
Wow.
I mean, stuff like that happened more than one time, and I didn't expect that to happen. But I was doing right. I was not going to try to, I was going to get, and I would have. He got every penny back, because we refinanced, and when I retired here 3 years ago, We had burned the mortgage, the big mortgage, about 2 years before that. When I retired, Pastor Parsons took over. Of course, he'd been working with me some time before that. We didn't owe anybody, didn't even owe a car payment, didn't owe nothing, and some money in the bank. That's God's grace.
That's God. You know, preacher, you've mentioned several times in our conversation, you've mentioned you and your wife.
Yeah.
You and your wife talking at the kitchen table.
Yeah.
When you got the call, you and your wife, her going with you.
Yeah.
I think one of the unsung heroes, and sometimes some of the unnoticed hindrances can be the wife of a preacher.
Oh, yes.
Can you speak to what your wife has meant to you as a counselor, as a friend?
Oh, yeah, all the way through. She's been one of the best preacher's wives any preacher could ever ask for. Soul winner, wise. I hate to say this, but a lot of preachers' downfalls are their wives.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
And mine was just the opposite.
Why do you think that is? If you had to put your finger on it with your experience.
Sometimes now, I'm not saying it's always the wife's fault. It's preacher and wife, but
yes, sir.
My wife and I did make a great team for the Lord. Discernment is so important. I'd say this to young preachers: discernment through the whole ministry, and it starts with your family. It starts with you and your wife. You gotta, of course, be in love. But young love will fade out if you don't have some deep character.
Yes, sir.
In there. And trust. My wife was a pretty lady. She's old now, but she's still a pretty lady. But the truth is that ministry, you hear about it. You hear about unfaithfulness, wife or husband. But here was a key that I don't know we ever said it so plain, but it was always a key with me. I knew my wife loved the Lord so much that before she could ever be unfaithful to me, she'd have to be unfaithful to God. And that was the great peace that I had. She led the ladies' visitation program. She was out doing what she had to do from time to time. Mm-hmm. But I never had a second thought about that.
As the church grew, as your ministry grew, obviously still having to serve the Lord, not having to, but serving the Lord and doing those things. But did her and her exposure, were you more guarded of that as the church grew? Did she become more aware of being pulled in a lot of different directions?
She was wise enough to never be a lady that had to be the limelight and had to be, and she avoided almost too much sometimes. Mm-hmm. But on the quiet side, her character and her qualities, it was so deep, and the ladies and the whole church respected, great respect there. But she was never the one that had to be in the limelight.
Right.
She was always, and one of the things, go way back to the very beginning when I preached to them about the way without a vision of people prayers.
Yes, sir.
I'd been serving in the church long enough to know about how things do happen sometimes. So I was trying to be mean that night so they wouldn't call me. So I said, now if you vote me in as pastor, you have a problem. You come to me, you don't come to my wife.
Yes, I said the same thing. Yes, sir.
I went by that. And so from that, people didn't. See a lot of people not going to come to the preacher, but they'll pester his wife and worry her.
Yes, sir.
And we, by the grace of God, didn't have hardly any of that. Mm-hmm. If you want to get me a message, you come to me.
Right.
And that later on, my wife, but my mom and dad was in the church. And I guess I had them scared enough. I never had no problem with that either.
Yes, sir. Yes. I remember I've said that before when we first started the church as we were growing. And then my mom here recently, we just moved her down from North Carolina. That's where I'm originally from. And I kind of mentioned the same thing as if you need me, come to me. Don't go to mom. Yeah. But it can happen that way. It can. But I think that I would have to say probably in my own relationship, probably if not the greatest, one of the greatest counselors in my life has been my wife, because she knows me so well, and what I'm thinking and what I'm afraid of and what I'm leaning towards.
The discernment that they have, and I mean, I'd tell funny stories and stuff about some of that too. You live with your wife, you almost communicate without talking sometimes.
Yeah.
And my wife never was much of a prankster, but she got me one time pretty good. Pops in my mind. We was eating, and she said, "You don't know what you said this morning, do you?" Like joking at me, like. And she would on occasion tell me, "Did you know you slipped up this morning and said so and so?" I said, "Yeah, don't remind me of it." That kind of thing. But that particular, we knew what would affect each other. So that particular day, she said, "You know what you said this morning?" I said, "No." About that time, the phone rang. She got up and answered the phone. I'm sitting there thinking, what did I say? What did I say? She's on the phone. What did I say? What did I do? And she was aggravating me that way. You know. It turned out to be nothing. But she let me sweat it out.
Let you sweat it out for a while.
But, I mean, we had a wonderful relationship. I only had one child, and he was a miracle baby. I think his story might be in that book. God said she couldn't have a baby. She wouldn't quit praying. And so he's a pastor also up in West Virginia now.
Yes, sir. Yeah, Brother Stephen, is that?
Stephen,
yes, sir.
But as far as the pastor and his wife, we had the best rapport and relationship, even with the church. Never had any problem with that. You know, I preached standards dress and stuff, and especially in the early years with the mini skirts and all that business. But the preacher's wife will set a trend. If she looks like the Christian she ought to be, it'll influence the women. And next thing, I remember when ladies first started teasing their hair. I was at I'm not going to use a preacher's name, but a well-known preacher. I preached sometime, not often, but a few times.
Yes, sir.
And his wife had teased her hair up really big. Okay, it don't bother me, but I looked out there, and in the congregation, a bunch of teenage girls had teased their hair. I thought, now, you'd set a trend.
You set a trend.
Your wife set a trend. Good and bad, you know, stuff like that, little stuff. I used to preach a sermon on occasion about little things. Little foxes. And if you get the little things right, the big things will amazingly be right.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes.
Isn't that interesting? So, preacher, His Hand is Real, the name of the book. We've talked about God's grace. Landmark Baptist Church, without a doubt, is a product of the power and the grace of God.
Yeah, I have to say that for sure.
Okay, so the $64,000 question is, what is the power of God? How does a man get the power of God? Why are we lacking? I said questions. But talk to us a little bit about the power of God. I don't know that we really know what that is.
Well, I guess everybody would define it maybe a little different. But when I surrendered to preach, I told you the story. The pastor asked me to preach for him on a Sunday night. Now, normally the only time I'd ever done anything was a little bit on Wednesday night. And during those times, Wednesday night or something, about like teaching Sunday school, which I'd been teaching young people, and so I was comfortable with that. But now I've got to preach on Sunday night. And that's a big deal to me.
Yes, sir.
And I'm scared about it. What I was really scared was I knew I'd surrendered now to preach. And I knew there was a big difference in teaching and preaching. I do both. I always taught my own Sunday school classes, adult class, as well as preach. A lot of preachers thought that was too much, and maybe it was, but I was comfortable with it. You know?
Yes, sir.
So on that particular night, here I am, a young guy, got to preach, and we had a pretty good good-sized church, and I would probably been more afraid to speak to them than strangers, you know. And so, of course, I studied and got some thoughts and all that. But when I got to church that night, I got there early. They had an old house we bought behind the church being renovated for Sunday school. So I slipped out to that house. I'd been doing a lot of praying, but boy, I got on my knees. I pray. If somebody had been in the other room, they'd have probably heard me. I was probably talking out loud. And that night, I claimed Zechariah 4:6, the B part. Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, saith the Lord of hosts.
Yes, yes,
not
sir.
by might nor by power. And I begged God for power. Well, sure enough, and I got in the pulpit and got going, and that power hit me that night. I knew something was different.
You knew something was different.
I knew something happened that night. It was different. I wasn't just teaching the scripture.
Yes, sir.
I was actually preaching. Then some of the folks, especially some of the older folks in church, when it was over, said, "God's called you to preach."
There was
and it confirmed
a validation from the people of God.
Yeah, and I told you about when I was pastoring the country church and got scared that Sunday morning because afraid to preach that night. Afraid I'd lost. I knew there was something different.
Yes, sir.
And so that verse for years became my theme verse. In fact, I finally purposely stopped doing it, but I would pray before I did my public prayer before I'd preach. And, all right, let's have a word of prayer. And I'd end every prayer, Lord, it's not by might nor by power, but by your Spirit. So, Father, and I'm trusting in your Spirit and asking in Jesus' name. I'd use that. It's almost like I made a crutch out of it for a while, and I got things. It was almost like a rabbit's foot. I didn't want to do that, so
yes,
I finally quit doing it. But for years, it was my comfort zone. I didn't care what they thought out there about it. I was trying to make sure God was with me right then, you know. And so the power of God, yes. Somebody explained it one way or another. I put it this way. You may not always know when you have the power of God on you, but you'll know when you don't. You'll miss it. Suddenly you'll feel the words are pretty empty.
Yes, sir. Now, over the years, and I'm not going to call names, but I can remember a very, very famous message, a very famous message. And I can give the title, but somebody can figure out the name, but the fresh oil concept of the power of God. And over the years, the power of God has been associated, I think, with if you have power, you have a certain number in your crowd, in other words, a certain size. But I've been in small churches on the side of a hill in North Carolina where I know the man has the touch of God, and he's running 75 in Sunday school. Have we missed somewhere along the way where we've equated the power of God with success?
The devil has took something that probably good intentions and made it wrong, because it's almost a mechanical thing. Like I told you about that great revival we had in the country, the small, it was the power of God. But Great Day, the Sunday school, I probably didn't have in Sunday school the Sunday before 60 people.
Yes, sir.
But we packed out the building in the revival meeting, and the power of God had fallen. I used to say, and this was that particular revival, we had strangers come on the parking lot just to see what was going on and get saved. Never came to get saved. I mean, stuff that happened that was almost supernatural. It was supernatural. And I still relate to that. We had some great revivals here in the 50 years I pastored here. I don't know that I ever had a one that had the power of God on it as much as I did that one revival in that country church.
Yes, sir.
It was just a thing where we was just saw God's hand. That's all there was to it. And I've had things like that happen here, but they don't happen as much in the last the last part of my ministry, I hate to say it, was not as good as the first part. And I say, well, probably lack of energy, lack of things I could, and all that had to play in the culture and the people, and all that changes. But I still felt like, and one of the reasons I could have kept going, my wife was beginning to hurt, had a little heart trouble. We didn't know it until about the time I retired. But I could have probably kept going, but I'd have been doing it out of duty, mechanics. I knew the way I could do it, but I didn't end up trusting the power of God like I did to start with, and that bothered me.
Yes, sir.
Because and that was my fault in a sense. But it wasn't that God didn't keep blessing, and He's blessed since Brother Parsons took over, and that was one of the. I point all the miracles I point out in that book and other things. One of the big ones to me, Brother Tillis, is how a guy ends his ministry. Mm-hmm. And, we trust God in the beginning, and we trust Him in the middle. We finally get older and can't do what we did. And a wise preacher will finally have to get to the place he says, now I'm not keeping up. I'm not doing. And that's where I got. And I prayed a lot about God sending me a man that, man, you don't want to give your life seal work. And you've seen this. I've seen some pretty big works just crash.
Yes, sir.
When the transition took place, it was the best. We've had a great transition here. We did it God's way, though. And I list it as one of the great blessings of God on my ministry is that I was able to see the work is stronger now than it was the day I resigned. And that's peace of mind. I know a preacher one time almost lost his mind over the fact that quickly after he resigned and somebody else came in, he just saw everything. That hurts.
Yes, sir.
That really hurts. And I'm blessed in that way. I appreciate, I give Brother Parsons credit, but I give God the credit because I prayed a lot about that. Right. And he helped me to get the right man to come. And I didn't just let him come and say, who's going to come in and preach a good sugar stick? And
right.
Yeah. He came and worked with me and proved himself. And I didn't even promise the man when he'd come, one day I'll make you the pastor here.
Right.
Never. I just asked God to show me. And the next thing I knew, I said, that guy is the one.
Yes, sir.
And I convinced the church of it. I used an illustration of Elijah choosing Elisha.
Yes, sir. Well.
Preacher ought to have a right. They voted. I gave the whole congregation a vote. They voted like 93 or 4%. And I don't even know the few that didn't vote. And maybe they left. So what? It's okay.
Right.
But I had all kind of confirmation he was the right man, and now it's 3 years later, and I know he was.
Yeah.
You know.
Over the years of your ministry, and this is maybe a huge question, but as you look back, where did you see that you developed as a preacher? And I mean that specifically, not so much a pastor, but where do you feel like you begin to really develop as a preacher? Where did you grow? Did you become... in other words, sometimes people mistake volume for power. Sometimes you learn you can say things the same way but better. In other words, how did you grow as a preacher in the way you approached it?
You know, naturally, the more you do something, the better you ought to learn from it. Learn from your mistakes as well. I wish I could communicate an answer to that a little better. I've taught preacher boys in college.
Yes, sir.
Discernment is such a big thing. Knowing the Word, but there's also a feeling, you know, you can discern whether you and the audience, where they're getting it, whether you're on the same page or not. I've seen preachers get up and have a good time preaching, but they were just either over the head or they were not communicating.
They were the only ones.
Yeah, they were the only ones
having a good time.
Out of it.
Yes, sir.
And so you learn how certain things, like you anticipate the human mind, and you can't hardly mechanically do it. It becomes somewhat of a feeling, which brings the Lord back into it. Mm-hmm. I've often said that, and I think maybe this is a teaching principle, if I'm going to communicate with you, I've just about got to start with something we both know and agree on, and then I may can move you to something from it. But you got to have that foundation.
Yes, sir.
In other words, that's hooking that's where you hook the person, and then you bring them along. And so there is that part of it. Now, knowing the Word of God is, of course, indispensable. You got that, and the Bible, of course, is the best book in every area, including even what's called psychology. The Bible is written that way. You know this, that God anticipates your mind too. He knows how to.
Yes.
That's why somebody can read the same scripture. Now they don't contradict, but then read the same scripture and get a separate blessing from it. It's that God's word so unique, and to just kind of you know somebody can take telling a joke now, and I'm not against telling jokes from the pulpit. I have a sense of humor in my preaching. But you take two different men tell the same joke. The audience gets it, has a big laugh on the way one tells it, and the other, what are you talking about?
Yes, sir.
I mean, that's part of it. Now, back to the question of the power of God, it is awful hard to define it because, like I say again, you do know, like I'm talking about surrendering the dog pen that night and many other times that God just broke your heart over something that was very real.
Yes, sir.
And I always kept that truth ahead of me, that it was not the might and power, not the organization, not even the money, but God's Spirit. That was the part that had to be real to me.
Right.
I said this more than one time, probably even in a sermon, but I said it a lot more to myself. Back to the title of the book. If God wasn't going to be real in it, if He wasn't real, then I need to drive a truck. I need to do something else that I could do mechanically, so to speak.
Right.
And if I had to have a successful pastor ministry by just using the tricks of the world,
yes,
that's like you do to build a business or whatever else. I didn't want that. I wanted it to be very real.
I remember years ago a message that Dr. Harold Sightler preached on the Word of God.
Yeah.
And he was talking early on there, and he said, somebody came up to him and said, "Preacher, you ought to write a book on how to build a church." And he said, "I don't know how to build a church." And he's, and I've often listened to the older men. Now there is those streams where the guys say, if you do X, Y, Z, you're going to get ABC every time. Yeah. But I found a lot of older preachers say, listen, I obey God, I did the best I can, but at the end of the day, I don't know. What would you say to that?
I'd have to agree to that. Of course, I also, Brother Sightler preached for me a number of times. He's a great man. And men like that become a mystery somewhat to others. I hate to say it, we're all human. We like somebody to give us a schismatic.
Right. Just tell me how to do it.
A, B, C, and D, and you get this.
Right.
But no, it's God's business, and you cannot rule God out of it. You've got to allow, we call it spontaneous. I mean, some of the best things I probably ever said I didn't have in my outline.
Yes, sir.
You just think, well, God gave me that. Mm-hmm. But he didn't give it to you ahead of time for you to, in other words, you realize later.
Right.
And my ministry, one big testimony on it is God had to do it. Now, I've heard other preachers say, well, and I think they were sincere that God had to do it, but I mean it for real with me.
Yes, sir.
I mean, so many stories, landmark stories. I had an old deacon that died here not too many years ago, and I think I did get the book out before he died, but in fact, we were going to build a little church museum in the college building, kind of showing our history, things like the youth camp where they're going out there this morning. There's a story behind all that.
Yes, sir.
And it's a story that brags on God every time. It's got one of God's miracles in it, or more than one. And I'm glad I can say that. I'm glad I can say it was a miracle ministry, and I know miracles are cheapened by the TV stuff and all the commercialism of it. But they are real. But you just don't order one. You don't control God. You don't turn him on and off like a light. You know. To say it was a miraculous ministry, I thank God every day that, like I said a while ago, that's still going, and thank the Lord for it. And there is a story behind this, that, and the other, but I had people ask me, well, did you know that? No, I didn't. I didn't really know what God was going to do. I believe he was going to do it right.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And I did trust him with it. And there's... My wife used to, you tell stories of your childhood and things, or you're doing anything you can to grab an illustration to communicate with. And I told her the story that when I was in the 3rd grade, born in Georgia, moved here in the 3rd grade to this town. We had a little creek up there. You couldn't hardly get your ankles wet. Lakes everywhere around here. Well, at the end of the 3rd grade, here in the little public school, we had a party. One of the richer kids in the class, big house on the lake, still there. I pass it every now and then. Big beach and dock behind the house. So we had a teacher, we're going to have our end of the year party out here at this house. And Lester's going to have us all over. We're going to have a big... So we had a big party in his backyard on the big trees and the lake and the dock. I mean, I'm a country boy out of the Georgia, and so... But I'm proud, as any of the rest of the boys. I was as big as any of them, and we played a little ball, and I could play ball as good as any of them, and they told us to wear, back in them days, what called short pants, a little different than now, but so we could play. Well, we got a little hot playing ball, and of course the boys are still showing off in front of the girls, even in 3rd grade. And so these boys all lived on the lake. They lived here. They all hollered, let's cool off and let's run to the lake, dive off. And now here I am. I know I can't swim a lake. I ain't never been in the water up to my waist. But I ain't going to stay back and say I can't swim.
Right.
So I ran with them. And when we all went off the dock, I went off with them. And foolish, yes. Crazy, yeah. But pride, man. You talk about pride getting you. And it was about like, I'd say, well, a little further than the choir bench, maybe as far as the wall from where we had a floating dock, and you went in the water and you swim out to the floating dock.
Yes, sir.
Well, I saw what they were doing, and I'd done just everything they did, I thought. And by accident, I kept my head up until I reached the dock. But I'd never done that before. When I reached it, it was kind of that old green slime on the post.
Yes, sir.
And I slid down. And I drank some, I was drowning, man. That's all there was to it. Well, one of the other boys had already crawled up on the dock, and he's a dumb old kid. He wasn't, had come to church here just before he died a time or two. But anyway, Lowell is his name. He saw me go under. I come up, and I went under again. I was drowning. He reached over and got me and pulled me up. Get up here on the dock, I was drowned. I lay up there on the dock. I'm about to die. But I didn't want nobody to know. I was still full of pride, full of water and full of pride.
Yes, sir.
And I'm laying on the dock, and I'm thinking, how am I going to get back to shore? I remember it good as if it was yesterday. Directly, one of them hollered, let's go back.
Oh.
And they all got up, jumped off the dock. Now, I got back at the very corner, and I ran as hard as I could. And I jumped as far as I could. Long time before I hit the water,
you were swinging away.
That's the way I learned how to swim without knowing it. I mean, saving my life. But I made it to shore. So, from time to time through the ministry, my wife would say, you jumped off in deep water again, didn't you?
I got to ask you this. What were your favorite series or topics to preach on? Tabernacle, Second Coming.
Yes.
I remember years ago, I heard you preach, and I remember you made the statement, just in passing, you said, I preached on the Second Coming. Maybe I preached a little too much on it, and then went on. And I remember sitting in the church going, if preaching too much on the Second Coming does this, I'm going to preach on the Second Coming. That's a good mistake. What were some of your favorite topics?
Well, truthfully is that you hit it. Second Coming was probably the biggest theme. I couldn't hardly preach a message without mentioning it one way or the other. Even Sunday morning here, I was teaching the Sunday school class. Of course, the assassination attempt just took place in Trump. And I had already predicted, in a sense, not predicted it, but talking about this was going to be an unusual year.
Yes, sir.
And I said some surprising things are going to happen because of all the mess the world's in, all the stuff that's happening. And so I was teaching through John, but I told him, I said, I know what's on everybody's mind. So I'm going to park John this morning, and I'm going to talk to the current events. And I did Sunday morning. So I wound up again telling them this is the best atmosphere we've had for the rapture in a long time.
Right.
And I used a truth here. We're in the, and I know the Jewish feast days, the 7 feast days, and that's argumentative whether we can make any sense, church age and Jew.
Yes, sir.
I'm accurate, I believe, in rightly dividing on all that. But an interesting thing is, Leviticus, folks don't study Leviticus much. But Leviticus 22, 3, 5, right in there, all the feast days and all. Actually, and I won't get into so much here, but actually God is speaking more directly to Moses than he does to any author in the Bible in the book of Leviticus. If you'll just keep noticing who's speaking, it's God. It's God again speaking, But anyway, all the deal there on the sevens, and I know you know Kevin Mann, he's put out some real good stuff on that. But we are in the Jubilee year now. It started, I think, about this last April. And here's the interesting thing. It's the 70th Jubilee year since Joshua took them into Canaan, took them out into the Promised Land. Oh, I hope that ain't going to
No, sir. We're good.
Anyway, now God dealt with the Jews. 70 years captivity in Babylon, 40 years in the wilderness. And he deals with numbers.
Right.
If God was wrapping it up, the Jubilee year was the liberty proclaimed through the land. And if God is fixing to switch from the church age back to deal with the Jews in the tribulation period, no better time for the rapture. He's got to finish off the church for the rapture.
Right.
So I'm teaching that Sunday morning. Yeah. So hobby horse maybe. I had to fight myself on it, but But now here's what it done for me. It was the blessed hope.
Yes, sir.
And the blessed hope purifies you. You'll fight the flesh better if you're expecting to see the Lord.
Yes, sir.
Do
you think that, and I'm leaning this way, but I'm a historian, and I find that the preaching that our generations before did, it's not that it wasn't practical, but it was profoundly heavenly, doctrinal, big, and practical was the secondary. Today's generation of preachers, it's almost exclusively practical.
Right.
How to have a good marriage, how to have good children, and it's needed. I understand that, but it feels like we've lost that heavenly. I've got a mansion over the hilltop. Have you seen that transition in your life?
Yes, I have, and I know what you're saying. Average church is telling you how to have a better life here, how to get. And these things are needed, family, husband-wife relationship, all this is, but deep down within all of us, it's still the biggest vision of all is facing God, going to heaven, the judgment seat, the whole thing. And if you got that hope in you, it will help you live straighter, fight the flesh better. I think you got to always keep that blessed hope out there. All right, I'm having trouble here and here and here, but bless God, this is temporary.
Yes, sir.
You know, and right now I'm enjoying the blessings of God, Christian life, and God's blessings and answered prayer and good things. But Paul said to live as Christ and to die as gain.
Yes, sir.
And you got to keep that gain out there. It's almost the carrot in front of the front of us donkeys. We praise God for it. Now, it's not pie in the sky like the communists want to tell us. We know it's real. And God does give us, I mean, He wants us to live by faith, but we do have little special blessings, little evidences, little answered prayers.
Little tokens. Yeah.
Really, it had to be God, so it makes it real, you know. Yeah. That's why I'm saying in the book there I tell so many stories. Little things, but I see God in them. And our people learned here that that the preacher did trust God, did believe God was going to do something.
Yes, sir.
And if He can do for the preacher, for the church, He can do it for me too. You know, get them to think that way. Yeah. Because otherwise we're no better off than the rest of the world. They're just doing their best ability, their talents, their ability, and their organization and all the things they have. We got a little more than that. We got a supernatural power there.
I know we're circling back to this, but that's been on my mind a lot lately. There seems to be a lack of the supernatural in our churches. Yeah. And it almost reminds me of the tabernacle, very plain. Then you got Solomon comes along and he builds a temple, and he has to put those narrow lights in there. And it's like, the temple's bigger, it's prettier, it's better, but nothing had the touch of God on it like that simple tabernacle. And I look at our forefathers, their buildings were simple, their programs were simple. They didn't have all the push-button gadgets, this and that, but there was a supernatural element. As opposed to today, it's not that I'm not calling into question our character, but it just doesn't have that electricity feel to it.
Well, that's that excitement thing of the Lord. It's I look back, of course, I've got the advantage now of sitting and meditating back on various things that I remember and where I really did see God in it, but I see Him a lot better in it now than even when it was happening to me. I mean, I'd look back and see where, well, if it hadn't been for the Lord, that would have been a disaster. Everything would have fallen. And that is missing now. And of course, we are independent Baptists, and we've seen the abuse, the TV preachers and others, and bless God, I'm going to send you a prayer cloth, and all this conning that goes on. Right. And I could tell you a lot of stories on that. But then, if we're not careful, we'll draw back too far to not be a miracle worker, conning somebody. We get so afraid of it, then we almost deny the power of God by trying to stay back from it too far. Yes. And you know, I've seen people shout, and genuinely it was of the Lord. I've seen some of them shout for attention too.
Yes, sir.
I remember a guy coming here not too many, maybe a year or so before I retired. We had a good service that morning. I think we had a few saved. It was good morning. He was a visitor. and possibly some kind of preacher. I don't know. I had never seen him before, but he shook hands with me in the aisle, and you know how you sense somebody's spirit.
Yes, sir. Discernment.
Discernment. And he said, I enjoyed the service, good service, but you just didn't have enough oomph in it. You just didn't have enough shout in it. You just didn't. In other words, we didn't get wild enough.
Right.
And I might have been a little mean that morning. It's not a good time to hit a preacher after you just been preaching. That is the wrong time to hit him.
Yes, sir.
And I said to him, I said, did you read the sign when you come in the front door? What? I said, it said Baptist. We're still Baptists. He got a little mad about it. I didn't care.
He didn't care.
I didn't care. I mean, I ain't never seen him again, never expected to, but I just let it. He wasn't fixed to have a circus in here. And I've had through the years, more than one or two people I've had to rebuke somewhat, to come in a church they've never been in before, maybe, but I want you to look at me. See me. Let me have a spell here. You can, oh boy, that guy's religious. That guy's really got, well, that kind of stuff makes me sick.
You know what, we have our church amens, but it's not a big,
right.
But I've seen people come through visit from time to time, and they're amening so loud that I've almost felt in my spirit that I need to, you know, just like, you know where you are, you know.
Yeah.
If you're Brother Sammy Allen's, you do whatever you want to do. But we're over in Bradenton. It's not Sammy Allen, so yeah.
I had a guy visit the first time. Oh, I've had nuts at times through the years. I had a guy, I think he was Moses, coming here. Another one said he was Jesus Christ. And I've had, you can't have 50 years in one place without having some of that
crazy
stuff.
Yeah.
One come in with a robe and had a staff. I've seen a few, and I can tell you, we can't take time for all that stuff. But a preacher, I've said this before, and this is not to just be funny. A preacher is a shepherd. He don't only have to lead the sheep, he has to fight the wolves off. And when you'll have some of your own sheep, if you hit the wolf too hard, how about the preacher, you hit him too hard?
That's so true.
And but if you don't, then you let this little wolf gets in, and another one gets in, and the next thing you know, your flock's messed up.
Yes, sir.
And the preacher does have to. That's part of his job too.
Yeah. Yes, sir. That is so true. Yes, that is so true. Let me change gears with you just a little bit. We have young men that are serving the Lord. We have young men around the country. We mentioned that we're independent Baptists.
Right.
I think probably now, by definition, independents have always been independent, but I think we're fractured now.
Yeah.
When I was very young, I remember you would go to Southwide, or you would go to these places, and even pastor school, different places like that. You would go, and even though you're from different camps and there was a camaraderie. We were a part of something big. It feels very fractured now.
Very much.
In the process of that fracturing, I feel like there's a generation of preachers, young preachers come along that don't really know the great men that have forged the path. You were with many of these great men. Yeah. So I'd like to throw some names out at you and just what did you glean? What did you take from them? Even at a distance, what did you see that maybe we don't see right now, but in that experience? And I think probably one of the great ones we just mentioned was Dr. Harold Sightler. You said you had him preach for you.
Yes, of course he'd gotten on older, and I don't know. He'd take a lot of his folks with him on a Greyhound bus they bought.
Yes, sir.
And he'd come by here. I don't know how many times, not a great amount, but I'd say 3-4 times, or 5 maybe during my ministry. And what I liked about Brother Sightler was he was just down to earth. You understood what he was saying. He wasn't trying to show off, but he would inspire you in the sense of, without feeling like somebody was trying to inspire you. it was just, again, I come back to God was real on him. And I didn't know all that much about his personal life. Never went to his house or anything, but he was a blessing. If he was preaching within driving distance, I'd go to hear him. And just respect for him. Probably one of the last times I might have heard him preach might have been at Southwide, about the time that Lee Robertson was retired.
Yes,
and
sir.
The man that followed Lee Robertson began to organize things a little different.
Yes, sir.
A little too different, too fast, maybe, whatever, I don't know. I didn't know him at all. But I heard Brother Seitler there at that time, and a few of the preachers was commenting, praise God, Brother Seitler's still here.
Yeah, yes, sir. Yeah. What about Dr. Robertson? Did you ever have any?
Oh, yeah, he was here a number of times. That book right there is, Dr. Lee Robertson begged me, because we'd talk, we'd eat together, he'd come preach for me, or he'd say, you got to put that story in a book. We didn't talk. Got to put that. He said, I'll write you a foreword to the book. I let him die before he did it. Or at least, I don't think the book come out before he died. But anyway, he'd encourage me in that, because he had those stories he'd tell too in his ministry. And he stayed pretty well the same. Now, he wasn't, we all know this, he wasn't the deepest preacher, but he inspired, he had God on him, and he could, we joke about it, he could get up and say Mary had a little lamb and get folks saved.
Yes, sir. Yes.
So, I mean, you take note of that. And a lot of folks don't know Dr. Lee Robertson. I mean, he could have been a very popular secular singer. He had a talent and a voice, but he laid that aside to be the preacher he turned out to be and the ministry he had.
What about, same thing, what about Dr. Hiles? Did you ever have?
Yeah, he preached for me here a couple of times. I preached in his college chapel up there a number of times for him. Dr. J.B. Buffington was a great preacher. He was actually a member here when he passed away, because he resigned the church over there. And Dr. Buffington would have Dr. Hiles every year at a certain time. So because we were 25 miles apart and good friends, I didn't try to have a meeting that ever conflicted.
Right.
After Brother Buffington retired and moved his membership over here, you know, a preacher has a problem when he retires staying in the church in some case. That's why I'm so blessed now.
Yes, sir.
With Brother Parsons, our transition. I joke about it. Say, Dr. Buffin, I told him, he come counsel with me. He said, I'm wanting to stay in the church, and the preacher says it'll be fine. I said, I hope it works, JB. We hadn't talked to him. But I predict you're going to have some problems.
Yeah.
I don't believe it was 2 months, maybe 3. He come over and he was dragging me. I got to talk to you. He said, it ain't working. He said, people ain't going to just leave me alone. And he said, I ain't going to be unethical and second guess the preacher.
Right.
Whatever. And he said, it just ain't working. What am I going to do? He said, you know, they gave me the parsonage. That's where I live. He said, they ain't far from the church building. He said, what am I going to do, Brother Carter? And I told him, I said, all right, JB, I'm going to tell you what to do. He said, I want to move my membership over, but what am I going to tell them over there? I don't want it to look like I'm boycotting the pastor. What am I going to tell them? I said, all right, I'm going to give you a little of my wisdom here. You tell the church over there that I've hired you on college staff to go around and represent the college, and you're preaching. Just don't tell them I ain't paying you nothing.
They don't need to know.
He said, that'll work.
That'll work.
So he moved his membership. He died over here. He's a great, honorable man. I love Dr. Buffington. And he was good friends with Dr. Hiles, having him that regular. Well, after he'd resigned over there, I guess they quit having Dr. Hiles, and I don't remember what period in Dr. Hiles' life where it was some of the problems and stuff, but anyway, he came and preached over here for me a couple of times. We used to have a preacher's encouragement meeting out at the youth camp in the summer, right after the schools were all closed down.
Yes, sir.
And Dr. Hiles, I believe he did preach for Brother Buffin, and then they both came on over and he preached out at camp. Well, you know how Dr. Hiles would have the question and answers.
Yes, sir.
And that was good. And we have a good turnout. I mean, had a lot of preachers. And it was interesting to have, Dr. Hiles was a master. He was about personality and
yes, sir.
And a lot of wisdom. I don't know. I'm gonna tell it anyway. You can cut down. But we had him out at camp preach that morning. And then we had, after the meeting, after the morning preaching, we went down to the cafeteria and tables, and all the preachers sat around, had the question and answer meeting. Well, Dr. Hiles, he would give us advice. I mean, all the time. He kept on saying, we got to get back to being Baptists. We got to get back to the old fundamentals. We got to get back to the old time way. We got to get back to wanting the power of God. I mean, and all that is 100% right.
Yes,
but
sir.
he kept on too much. Get back. And I'm setting up from him. And I don't know how I respond to time. I said, Dr. Hiles, some of us never left.
Okay. There is a uniqueness about pastoring in Florida. Every place, every region has its own, but Florida being the peninsula, it is sort of its own little thing there. What were some of the biggest preachers that influenced you? If somebody were to look at you, and who would be in your lineage? Who would they say, boy, that preacher influenced him, or that particular book, or that particular writer? What was the biggest influences?
I did learn from different ones. I learned things from Dr. Hiles. I never tried to be him, because
there's only one.
A lot of the young preachers did. That was, tried, and it could only be one of him.
Yes, sir.
There was others. There was some of them controversial, different ones. I guess as I got older in the ministry, this whole thing about don't criticize a guy for you walked so many miles in his moccasins, know.
Yes, sir.
I found out this. Some preacher might have done a great work, and it's too bad if he messed up around the end. That does not mean all of that was no good. And this is where young preachers get misled sometimes. Okay, he did this, this, and this, but he messed up. Well, David messed up too. And I'm not excusing that.
Right.
Thank God that didn't happen to me and some others. But at the same time, don't throw all the baby out with the bathwater. Don't just say none of that. No, the man might have been 100% right, and then the devil did trip him up.
Yes, sir.
But it didn't nullify what he said was truth was still truth, And I'm not condoning that, and thank God for preachers that don't mess up their testimony for it. And one of the prayers I often said, Lord, please don't let me mess up in the end. I want to finish right.
Yes, sir.
I learned a long time ago on the racetrack, I never got a trophy unless I finished the race.
Right. Right.
And that sort of thing. But I did learn from different preachers, and you'll pick up a mannerism if you're not careful. I can't remember the old preacher's name. It was right before I was even in the ministry. He'd come and preach for us. And I guess he probably had a pain or something back here, but he'd get wound up, and he'd go back and forth, and he'd have that hand on his hip. And great preacher. I was preaching a sermon and was preaching one Sunday morning, and I got wound up, and I put my hand on my hip, and I trotted back and forth.
Yes, sir.
I was just doing it automatic because I was seeing him in my mind.
Right.
Later on, one of the ladies said, you got kidney problems? I thought, what'd that do?
What'd you
You
do?
had your hand. I thought, oh, my soul. Didn't do it no more.
I do. I think young preachers sometimes they
The
mistake
mannerism.
the mannerisms or even just the idiosyncrasy of the man, and that equates the power of God.
Oh,
yeah.
But that is the danger. That is a danger. I know a young preacher. He got Dr. Hiles tapes, and he could preach about as good as Dr. Hiles as far as the information and all that. But it's just not you. It's not the same, and he totally depended on it. I wanted to think. I don't believe he'd preach a sermon if he didn't first hear Dr. Hiles preach it. You know.
Yeah.
Well, again, he probably got a lot of folks saved and all that, but to feel like it's you and God. Mm-hmm. And that don't mean I'm going to go out of the way not to say something that man said or do something that man did. But at the same time, I don't depend on that.
Yes, sir.
I mean, you just, and that was the negative of some of the big preachers, everybody trying to copy them. Mm-hmm. I had a funny thing happen here one time. I'd preached in Hyles-Anderson College, and I'd preached a sermon. It was my own original sermon. I had actually gotten it the week of youth camp. I was out there. I used to stay out there with them. I'd rough it. And I was out there all the week. And it is, if you go to our camp, it looks like a snaky place because it's out in a reclaimed Florida swamp.
Okay.
But it's not. It's actually, we had no snake problems. But people got to talking about some of them from the city had never been out in the country. Oh, snakes, you know.
Yes, sir.
So that got a little talk around camp about it. And somehow or another, I got on a theme about snakes. Well, not really about snakes, but I preached on build above the snake line. You may have heard it, build above the snake line.
Yes, sir.
Well, I preached that at my church one time. And then shortly in that time frame, I preached up at Hyles-Anderson College. Well, back then they had quite a number, probably had claimed 2,000. I don't know if it was all that many there, but it's a big crowd. And I preached it. And it went over pretty good, I thought. I had a retired airline pilot in my church. He flew the big planes, but one time he had a job of flying the cargo planes over from Africa or somewhere, and they'd bring in these animals that was experimented on, monkeys and things, and unload at Miami. And then they'd take off with the empty plane. Of course, it had crates in there where keeping the animals instead of seats. So he told me this story, and I used it for a concluding illustration on that build above the snake line. He and his co-pilot emptied the plane. He's taken back across out over the ocean, and they kept hearing a noise in the back of the plane. Finally, the co-pilot went back there with a flashlight, and there's a big old animal. They call him a rat, but he's as big as a country possum, African. And somehow he had hid, and they had not unloaded him. And he was back in the back tail of the plane where all the lines and controls were at. And what they were hearing, he was gnawing.
Oh my goodness.
He was gnawing on one of them control cables. And the co-pilot couldn't reach him, couldn't get him, see him with the light. Come back and he told Brother Orwell, my man, my pilot, church member, good Christian. He said, one of them big, whatever, we'll call him a rat. He was another name for him. We're going to go down if he chews that cable. And said he just keeps on chewing on it. And they could hear him all the way up the cover. He said, what are we going to do? We're going to turn around and go back? He said, we're going to lose control back there. And Brother Orville said to him, he said, sit down and put your oxygen mask on. And he took the plane up. They keep listening to the rat. The higher they get, the weaker the rat gets, and finally he stops. He said, go back and look at him now. Come back and said, he's either dead or asleep. He said, well, he didn't have an oxygen mask, did he? And I use that point about in the environment. We're to fly above. We're not down there with the rats.
Right.
We are breathing high oxygen. I mean, build above the snake line. Don't live down there with the snakes. Don't get down there with that crowd. It was a great illustration. And so we're having our own college graduation about a year, 2 years later. And my college president at that time invited a speaker. I didn't know the speaker. He did, I guess. So we're sitting there, pretty good crowd. So he introduces the speaker for the night. The speaker gets up. He said, I'm going to preach a sermon on build above the snake line.
Oh my goodness alive.
Now I'm sitting there. Now my college students and staff, all but the college president, he'd never heard me preach that. He was confident. He didn't know. He thought everything was fine. Every time I'd look at somebody and meet their eye, I'd have to duck my head because they all wanted to laugh. The guy had my sermon. He preached it better than me. He finished up with that last illustration.
No, he did not.
Oh, yes, he did. I mean, every bit of it.
No, he didn't.
So that's the danger, man, when you steal something, getting caught. And so when he finally finished his message and finished with my illustration, I'm still looking down. And college president said, you going to conclude? I said, no, you do it.
What would you do?
If I'd have got up, I'd have bust out laughing at every student that had heard me preach that, So there's the danger, man. The and that just happened to me. But I wonder how many times that might have happened to Dr. Howells or somebody else.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. Could you imagine you getting up and saying, hey, that was a wonderful message?
I wasn't going to get up and be the hypocrite.
No.
And if I'd have met, so I would just, they were ready to burst in the laughter, stuff like that. We got Spurgeon, I guess it was, said, talking about using other men's material. He said, you can feed in other men's pastures, but you ought to give your own milk.
Oh, that's a great line.
In other words, and I've kind of tried to do that my own self, or give credit. There's a sword of the Lord back there on the counter, most recent, I guess, and Curtis Hudson. It was his last sermon he preached at Southwide. Remember he died of cancer.
Yes, sir.
They put a mattress on a bus, and he rode that to get that mattress, and they drove him to Southwide.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
I knew Curtis pretty good, and when I wrote that little book, Things That Are Different Are Not the Same on the King James Bible, I sent it to Curtis. In fact, Sword may have printed the first, or I sent it to him under the idea of Sword printing it, I'm pretty sure.
Yes, sir.
And he was already sick with cancer. I can't remember if they printed the first set of them or not, but anyway, he preaches his last sermon at Southwide. I was not there, but some of my people were college people. And so Curtis gets up, and it's in the Sword. You can read it in the first paragraph. He gets up, preaches his sermon. The title of it, Things That Are Different Are Not the Same.
Yes, sir.
But he says in the next paragraph, Dr. Carter sent me this book, and the title caught my attention, so he gave me credit for the title.
Right.
It wasn't the same sermon by no means.
Right.
But do you know, too, I called him later on the phone, not about that, because he was getting close to dying, and I'd called him before, and he told me he was on his deathbed, very weak. He said, "Preacher, just quit praying for God to heal me. God's already told us we're not going to be healed." He said, just pray for my testimony, and stuff like that. He said, "Don't even pray." But then he told me in that same conversation, he said, "Do you know, after I preached that sermon and used the title of your book?" I said, "Yeah, I appreciated that you didn't have to reference me. It wasn't the same message." He said, "Would you believe I got some nasty phone calls and a nasty letter or two over that?"
Really?
I said, "Man, you on the sick bed and you got them." And I'm talking about from some preachers.
Yeah.
Then that really bothers me.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you disagreed with the King James issue or whatever, to attack a man that's dying, that's discouraging.
Sometimes the Christian world can do you dirtier than the law.
Oh, yes, sir. The old story about shooting our own wounded and all that. There's something to that. And as I got older, I'm sure if I went back to some of my early sermons, I was maybe too hard, and I was cut and dried, and everything had to be just right. But I found out that God can hit a straight lick with a crooked stick.
Yes, sir.
And I've seen some men that I would not maybe even have them preach for me. But I saw they done some good, and I left them alone. I didn't attack them.
Yeah.
And it's, boy, I'm telling you what, the judgment seat is going to be what we all dread from sometimes of misjudging. And I'm not a liberal by no means, and I don't tolerate liberalism in that sense, but I also recognize, and you find some examples in the Bible, sometimes somebody had to grow. I mean, you go through the book of Acts and find out they had to grow through there.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
And it's amazing sometimes how we don't give people time to grow, or even give them the food to grow on.
Yes,
but we expect them to already be at the level we are, and that's where preachers have got to be careful. We all got some help from somebody's book, somebody's message, something else, or whatever. So I probably, if I was starting to preach a ministry again, I probably would have a little more sense and some of not be quite as hard. I remember when my baby and my wife, our son came along late in our life, miracle baby, because doctors said she couldn't have a baby, and she kept praying, and we did. Anyway, my secretary, who at that time had been with me 20 years, she'd been with me, and I think she was my son's Sunday school teacher when he probably got saved. But somehow in conversation one day, she said, talking about a few years back, she said, "We were sure glad when you and the wife had a child." Said, "You was too hard on us." Said, "Then you learned some experience. Your own child."
Yeah.
She was a kind of lady that you'd take advice. She was wise.
Yes, sir.
We laughed about it. And I said, she said, "You mellered some after you got that baby. You found out the truth about it, didn't you?"
Experiences, yes.
She was right.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Well, as we're wrapping up, let me ask you this: you've got young men in the ministry. You've got several different generations. This is a huge. You say, what advice would you give? Well, there's just a lot of. I mean, that's a semester worth of teaching.
Yeah.
But what do you see now, where we are? And you said if you were starting over now.
Yeah.
What would be some of the things we know what we wouldn't change on. We wouldn't change on the Bible. We wouldn't change on our doctrine.
Right.
But what would be some of the things that you would say, I think, knowing what I know now, I would approach it a little bit more this way? What would you say to younger men like that?
Well, you said something in the early beginning about quantity and quality. There was a time there, and I went through it, a lot of preachers went through it, that we'd always say it was not about numbers, but we were really going after numbers. And that in itself is not wrong, because every number's a soul. And I don't know if you ever read R.A. Torrey's book on soul winning.
Yes, sir.
Earlier, he was, even though I think he was Presbyterian and so on. But anyway, if you do the math on it, you know the exponential curve on math. Well, you got the example, many examples in the Bible, but the woman at the well in John 4.
Yes, sir.
Jesus took time for one, and the whole village was reached. Well, probably what I might have missed in my earlier part of my ministry was I would have spent more quality time getting one thoroughly done, realizing that one may reach this village.
Right.
But it takes time to realize that. You think you got to go out and fast as you can, notch your gun, so to speak,
yes, sir,
as much as you can. And yeah, every soul is important, but I think back, probably at my country church, I didn't have the population. So I did more quality work. You went after one because there wasn't another one to go to.
Right.
You know? And yet that paid off in the long run, because I can go back there now and see those same people serving God as older people. One of us young people.
Right.
You know. And probably here, I had more population to reach. I was trying to reach everybody I could, fast as I could. And we did, by the grace of God. And probably in the early 70s, my church, I look on it now, and I didn't even think about it. I remember when John R. Rice came out in the Sword. I had been here by that time, I'd been here about 4 years. Mm-hmm. We had started growing like unbelievable, even though I didn't realize it. I wasn't bragging about it. I didn't know what. John R. Rice come out in the Sword. He said, let's baptize 200 this year. Mm-hmm. Well, that was a big goal. I'd never thought about how many am I going to baptize this year.
Right.
So then I went back to our records, and the year wasn't half over, and I'd already baptized about 160. So I went way over 200 that year. Uh-huh. But that was the numbers game that was being talked up, and Dr. Hiles was, to a great degree, inspired everybody, and I understand what he was doing. He was trying to get them to shoot at a star, you know,
right.
Shoot the moon, hit a star, whatever, you know. I understand that. Now, I'm not criticizing that, except to say a lot of preachers, though, will take a truth a man speaks and then go to the extreme, and they'll break it off in the ground, so to speak. All of a sudden, then you got somebody with a baptism tank on the back of the bus. Yeah. So I can say I baptized and baptize them again next week. Same ones. Yes. And all that. See, that's the danger that can come from just that. Right. And so I look back and I'd say quality in the sense of you're not wasting your time if you do a third job. You don't know that one is going to turn out like the woman at the well, reach the village, but there's a potential that it might. And R.E. Torrey said, if you'll do the math on personal soul winning, he said the fellow that more or less pitches a big tent and gets 1,000 professions, some of them are real, maybe, and some of them aren't, but he said the guy that consistently wins one here and wins one there, then in the period of years, the exponential curve sets in on that, and that's where the real quality comes in. And I meditated on that some through the years and saw the truth of it. I was in the Philippines here a few years ago. They kept on wanting me to come over there, and after preaching, and all I want to tell you, that I could work me to death over there. I mean, man, so many. Anyway, they'd want you to sit on the platform, and all the preachers would gather to ask you questions.
Yes, sir.
Well, I didn't know it before I had gotten there. There was apparently some preachers from some denomination, whatever, I don't know, had gone over and was holding these big rallies, taking pictures. Many walking the aisles. Well, I started gleaning from the questions the preacher was asking me. They had a big question going. I found out that people were being paid to come to the crowd, make the pictures, come back home and get the support from the pictures. Well, of course, I told him, I said, no, I don't agree with that. Well, and I don't agree with it. I mean, it's just
manipulation,
using religion and
right,
and getting some big money raising going on in the States, because, well, we look what we done over here with it, but didn't tell them, they paying them to come and doing all this stuff.
Yeah.
So of course I condemned that. Well, I got home, then I got some letters from some of the preachers, not independent Baptists, I don't think, but I got some nasty letters. You messed us. No, it was the crowd that was doing that. So these Filipino preachers, they started saying, no, Dr. Carter said that was wrong. So next thing I know, I'm getting shot at about going over and messing up my ministry.
Right.
Right's right and wrong's wrong. That's
right.
all there is to it.
So that really, because I could talk with you all day, but as that story right there brings us back really to the title of the book, and I think what we've been talking about is His hand has to be in it. His hand is real. It either has to be God, and if we're manipulating something, if we're managing, trying to massage it, that's not God. Right. It has to be the hand of God.
Yeah. I've seen a few miracles that I won't tell it now, but one in particular, I told the folks I'm gonna tell you. I was preached a sermon on miracles one Sunday morning, but I said I'm gonna tell you a story, and if I was sitting where you're at, I probably wouldn't believe it. But I know, so I'm gonna tell you. When it's that real, but if it's manipulated, if it's a plan and you set the trap, I think you not only you may God may judge you for it, number one, because you used it in His name, and number two, when somebody else finds out it was a trick, then when you have destroyed somebody's faith, and however much they're going to pass it on to somebody else.
Yes.
I had very few healing miracles. I have seen some prayers answered that it had to be answered prayer. People living that should have died, according to the doctor. I've had that. Every preacher's had some of that. I was... Of course, I abused my eyes in my hot rod days. I tell you a lot of stories about that, but I always had pretty good eyesight. When I was about, here I am, 89. When I was about 52 maybe, I started noticing my long sight. I was getting to where I joked about it because everybody always kids me about driving fast because of my background. And I'd say, well, I'm having a little eye trouble. I can't read that sign because I'm going too fast. And so the truth was I was losing my long-distance vision. So Kevin Mann was my song leader at that time. A little dope-shooting hippie got saved. You talk about a guy that really got saved, become a new creature. And I'd lost my song leader for some reason there, and so Kevin was leading singing, and he was a fireball in them days, had a good voice before he lost that voice. So I'm sitting up there with Kevin. Sunday school's over. We got 7 or 8 minutes getting the choir out, getting started. Sitting there side of Kevin, and pretty good crowd, pretty full building. And the door right there, you can see how the distance, same distance. The building has been widened since then, but same distance. And I said, Kevin, who's that visiting lady coming through the door? He looked at me and he said, quit joking. I said, wait, I said, who is that? He said, preacher, that's your wife. I realized I'm going to have to get glasses. I didn't want to get them, but I did. I went to the doctor and then I depended on them. I wouldn't go driving. Now, reading, I could still read without them, but driving my car, I always had my glasses. Mm-hmm. And I kind of joked around with the church. I said, I always wanted glasses so I could pull them off and make a point. Joked about them. But I hated them. Tell you the truth, I hated them. I couldn't get used to them. I remember one time I had a flat tire, and I got out and changed the tire. I laid the glasses on the ground and put my knee on them, broke them all to pieces. And just saying, and I just kind of griped about them. I joke about them a little bit in church, but just wasn't. Well, I wore them for about 5 years. I had to have them to drive. I wouldn't drive without them. And keep them on up here if I wanted to see who was on the back row. I couldn't see who was on the back row without them. So we made a trip to Israel. I think it was a little college group or something went over to Israel. Jeff Cruz was my tape man, cameraman. He was really good at all that stuff. Passed away not long ago with cancer. But anyway, we're in a hotel over there in Jerusalem. My wife was with us on that trip, and I was wearing my glasses, and I had that little screw come out of them or something, and I patched it up. But got up that morning to get on the tour bus, and I didn't pray about it. I was just griping kind of to the Lord that morning because we was kind of hurrying to get off the bus. Glass was laying on the table, and I said something negative about him. And I did not hear an audible voice, I'm sure, but I heard a message. And here's what the message said. If you really believed I could give you your eyesight, whatever I said to the Lord about he said, you'd leave them glasses laying there. Now, so help me God, I just left them laying there. Just left them laying there. Get out on the bus. My wife says, you forgot your glasses. I said, no, it's okay. She said, you won't be able to see nothing out. You look through the windows of the tour bus. I didn't tell her that I thought God had spoke to me, and I wasn't sure that he had. I mean, it was just, if you really believed I could, you'd leave them laying there.
Yeah.
Well, we're going on down the road, and Jeff Cruz is my cameraman. He's up at the window taking pictures like you do for the ministry. And he starts hollering and getting excited. He's a country boy, and he's what I'd call deer, but they got another name for him. Biblical deer type creatures up on the side of the mountain. He spotted them because he got them strong lens on the camera.
Yes, sir.
So he's calling everybody and telling about them. So I'm still sitting on the back there, and I didn't get up and go to the window. And he said, preacher, you got to see these things. I said, Jeff, they're up on the side of the mountain. Yeah. I said, I couldn't see them. I left my glasses at the hotel. Well, you can come look through my camera. And he just wouldn't take no, so I finally get up, and I go over to the window, and I see the deer. I said, you mean yonder? He said, yeah. I said, about a dozen of them over there? Yeah. He said, you want my camera? I said, no, I see them. I went and sat back down. I was a little bit in shock. I knew something had happened. I'll cry again if I ain't careful. Because I didn't put them on again. I ain't never put them on again. I still drive without them.
Yes, sir.
Now, I don't see probably as good as I did that day. I'd still pass my driver's license test without them. I still read my Bible, 89 years old. So I got home. I joke at my wife a little bit. She's talking to the ladies in church. And here's what they all come with their great wisdom. And they said, oh, he's got cataracts. He's got cataracts. You see good for a while, but now he's in trouble. He's got cataracts. My wife said, you got to go to the eye doctor. I said, I'm not going to do it. I said, I made a commitment to God, and I left them there. And yeah, you got to go to the doctor and see. Finally, to satisfy her, I joke about the ladies and all their great faith, you know, but I went to the doctor, same one that had given me my glasses. And, you know, most doctors are a little bit foreign. He was a little bit foreign. I don't know, Korean or Chinese or whatever he was. Good guy. He put me through every kind of eye test. And come back and sit down with him. I said, well, what about it, Doc? He said, preacher, all I can say is God has blessed you. That's what he said. I've never worn any sense. Now, that's a miracle. It had to be. It proved out to be.
Yes, sir.
So I tell about miracles with other people and personally on myself. Now, I waited almost 20 years before I ever told the church, before I ever explained it. I was preaching on miracles one Sunday morning, did not have it in my notes. And it was like God said, all right, tell them about your miracle. And I knew I better then. So I told him, I said, I'm going to tell you something that you might not believe, but some of you are old enough to remember when I was wearing glasses.
Yes.
I got pictures around here, a few pictures, got my glasses on, you know. So to think that the great God Almighty, little old peon, little old ant on the ground, that he gave me that special blessing. And I've asked him for things for other people, even loved ones and others. And apparently God said no. You know, I have seen some folks get off the sick bed that I know God answered prayer.
His hand is real.
But I had an urging from God to do it. One of my head bookkeepers here, Brother Baker, he was at the point of death in the Orlando hospital. We've been praying for him for weeks, and it was a bad deal. And on a Wednesday night, I don't remember if I'd already taught a Bible lesson. Maybe I had. But I was impressed to do it. I mean, I didn't even think about it. I didn't think about it in the office. But,
yes, sir.
I mean, I'd been praying. I just told the church, I said, look, I feel led to ask everybody that will to just, for a few minutes, come to the altar and let's just pray for Brother Baker right now. And we did. Well, his wife, she just walked through the building a while ago. His wife, Anita, was at the bedside with him. And it was a liver transplant that was going to have to take place if there was any hope at all of cancer in the liver. And she was talking to him, sitting at the bedside. And he's pretty weak, but he raised his hand and said, hush, something's happening. While we were praying, God answered the prayer, and he felt it.
Wow.
At that time. He'll talk to you about it every now and then. He ushers for us. He's around here every now and then. So everybody knows I ought to be dead. So God is real. God is real. And that probably, if I had any one theme on my ministry, it would be God is real. And it's not, I don't have an inside track with God, but I have seen him through his grace do some miraculous things. Preacher, thank you so much. Will you lead us? I'm afraid I might have just took you in a different direction you wanted to go. Will you? No. Will you lead us in a word of prayer? Yes. Will you do that? Yes, I will. Father, I do thank you for these men you've led to come over this morning, and I thank you, Father, they honor me, but more, Lord, they're honoring you, to see how you've used somebody like me, Father, how your grace has been real, how you've been real, and how a ministry has grown up here that nobody could have ever seen ahead of time and believed. And Father, I thank you that you've been very real to me through the years, so much more than I ever deserved, so much more that I can hardly believe sometime myself. But Father, I do give you all the praise and all the glory for all the good things that's happened with the Landmark Ministry, for the missionaries that have been trained and on the field, for the pastors that have started churches, for the bus ministry still going, and other things that you've blessed through the years, and the good people you've sent to hold up this preacher's hands. And Father, how you've supplied every need. And Father, I look back and I praise you. I see how real you've been, and I thank you for it. I ask your blessing on these young men and preacher boys in our colleges and churches that just need to realize that all the things they can learn will be a help. But Father, without you, it'll not work. I pray they'll learn to depend on you, to trust you, to believe you. And I just ask, Father, that they do it all for your honor and glory, and that souls would be saved because of it. Again, we thank you for this tape that's being made. Lord, may your blessing be on it to help somebody. And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.